I want to talk to you about the intricacies of flight and to share with you some of the remarkable truths there are that we can learn about God's world when we consider the flights. Thinking of life and, of course, flying life, if I can create life here, this little scientist is saying, then it will prove that no intelligence was necessary in the beginning. That says more about the lack of intelligence of that scientist than about the truth of evolution and those ideas. A certain scientist from Oxford, you may have heard of him, said this, Professor Richard Dawkins, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Some statement that, isn't it? Philip Johnson, whose book some of you have read, said this, if you're going to teach the Darwinist view that organisms may look like they were designed but weren't, then you have to allow for the possibility that they look like they were designed because they were designed. And basically, he's a lawyer, and he's brilliant in his books. You need to look at them, Darwin on Trial, The Wedge of Truth, many other books that he's written. Very, very precise in some of his statements concerning the whole philosophy of this battle of creation versus evolution. We need lots of folks to be involved in the creation ministry, not just people who are scientists, but people who are historians, people who are lawyers. We need all these folk getting involved and speaking. We need more folk like that in England. And, we're only here for a while, able to take the baton a bit further during our generation. We need to be promoting other people to speak. And where I go, I'm trying to promote others to begin to speak on this issue. So I'm going to think about flight tonight, which, of course, is a subject dear to my own heart because I've come through the training of aeronautics. I was for 4 years working for the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and that was before I went into combustion, which is what I do my main work on now. But I'm been involved for a long while in aeronautics. Some facts then about the flights in the living world, and then, as it says there, about complexity and information. So anything which flies really needs attention to detail, and it needs purpose and very careful precision in the makings of it, as was found out when Columbia sadly blew up as it was coming back into the atmosphere, and then there was that terrible accident to Challenger some years before. You really do need to get things right, and of course NASA have learnt the hard way on that, and we've every sympathy with the families of those who died, of course, in that dreadful accident recently. But, it really draws attention to the fact that you've got to get things precise. And anything which flies requires precision. These Arctic terns, which fly 12,000 miles from one pole down to the other pole, just because they like a bit of sunbathing and they get more of it in the Antarctic during the southern, summer there. And then they have to fly all the way back to the North Pole, and the only thing that stops them is predators on the way. Remarkable creatures. And yet people say they just sort of happened. And I want to show you that really that just is not the case. There's been the urge to fly, of course, for many, many centuries before finally the Wright brothers, whom we celebrate 100 years of aviation this year, of course, got it right. And that chap dived to his death on the left. He didn't get it right. He didn't understand the need for hollow bones and power-to-weight ratio to be right. And this chap on the right, well, he was cheating, of course, because he wasn't having a heavier-than-air machine. So that didn't work. And the Wright brothers, of course, got it right in North Carolina, just about coming up to 100 years ago exactly. And there have been other claims to powered flight, but I think the Wright brothers really do have it, because although they were a bit unstable, they did manage to get that aircraft going. Of course, the French had to get in on the act pretty quickly, as they flew first across the channel and tried to, perpetuate the wars, the Napoleonic Wars, and we've never forgiven them ever since. But there we go. Blériot landed as if to claim England again. But there we go. And there are many creatures which fly, of course, and I'm just going to pick out one or two. The black kite shown on the left, a kestrel shown on the right. Kestrel because it has this remarkable ability to hover and is able to, just by flicking its wings, if you look at a kestrel next time you're going down the freeway and you look at the way they just sort of stay in midair, not by using the hummingbird method of hovering, but by a completely different mechanism, just flicking the outer part of their wing and using their tail feathers as well, and they dive down, of course, to get their prey. Remarkable observation when we look at the kestrel. And I want to look at a number of flying creatures, but those are just a couple there. Day 5, of course, was when all the flying creatures, as well as the fish and other creatures in the sea, were made. How remarkable, of course, that was the flying creatures made before day 6, when all the land creatures were made. I think God has a sense of humor, doesn't he? In that he puts those things which we might say, oh, those should have come afterwards. He said, no, I made them before. I didn't need land creatures. I didn't need lumbering reptiles in order to actually make flying creatures. I made them beforehand. And of course, any idea that there's an evolutionary progression is complete nonsense. When you actually come to the scriptures, it does not fit. The scriptures have no notion of evolution from the beginning to the end. You cannot fit evolution into the Bible. And that, by the way, is the burden of my book, Genesis for Today, which deals with a lot of those things from a biblical point of view. Here's a Lockheed TriStar, flaps down, coming into land at Montreal in the snow. Right, and the very crude flaps go out at the back, as you've all seen when you're landing in planes, as many of us do these days. Here's Swan, Mark 1, flaps down, nose forward, coming into land at Swan Lake. Which one is the more versatile? Well, I would suggest to you clearly the Swan, because the Swan has variable camber wings at the back. It has the ability to be able to change its the whole surface of its wings, not just one part, as it comes into land. It may have a slightly ungainly way of putting out its undercarriage, but it works, and it's no problem. It also has a variable nose, just like Concorde, but far more versatile. And anyway, Concorde's going out now, so we don't refer to Concorde. But there is clearly detail and precision and design, even just by looking at these creatures. Now, I want to show you in a bit more depth than that, but the sheer beauty of these creatures shouts design. Now, there are 3 main creatures which have the ability: birds, flies, bees, wasps, etc., and then mammals and bats. Bats would be an example of that. And then there possibly was a 4th creature, but most folk would say these days, in the creationist circles certainly, that the flying reptiles, the pterosaurs, are really probably more akin to the bats than they are to be regarded as a separate creature. And many people think that there is something in their structure which would strongly suggest that they were a type of creature similar to a bat. So we'll just say that there are 3 main creatures which fly. That, of course, is a staggering fact, because that means that there's no connection. Any evolutionist will agree with this. There's no connection between those 3 types of flying creatures, and yet they're supposed to have each one evolved flight independently. To say that it happened once would be incredible. To say that it happened twice would be quite stunning. To say that it happened 3 times is totally scientific nonsense. And I would suggest to you that that mere fact alone destroys any idea of evolution of flight. Let's just think of birds for a moment. We have bones which are hard and brittle, particularly as you get older, like some of us who are a little over the hill. But, if you had hollow bones, you really would have a problem. They would snap so easily. But a bird's bones, except for the loon bird and 1 or 2 others, most birds have hollow bones. 99.9% of birds have hollow bones. Just 1 or 2 diving birds perhaps will have some birds which are partly hollow and others not. But that is because of the environment that they are living in and made for. So the bird's hollow bones, like this metacarpal bone of a vulture shown at the top, are very important. But if you just had a hollow tube like a straw, it wouldn't work, unless you had the important cross members here, which are called in aircraft engineering terms, they are called the Warren's Truss arrangement, because a chap called Warren noticed this in birds and said we can use this in aircraft. And this became a major factor when they were building very fast fighter aircraft in the Second World War. And that's where it all really began. Aeronautics really literally took off, as you can understand, in wartime, as it was so important to get aircraft which worked and beat the enemy. So for birds, the bone structure must be exceedingly light and hollow, unlike land-based creatures. And of course, made of struts is so important. Just as you have a bridge with cross members on, you need those cross members to provide strength. So this is a marvel of lightweight engineering. And who made the Warren's Truss? Was it really Warren? No. It must have been a great designer who put it there to begin with, to get all those bones to be operating properly. Otherwise, you would have had the problem of, and you should have seen it in the fossil record, of lots of sort of experiments at getting the angle right for these cross members. But we don't. We find birds are fossilized with bone structures exactly like modern birds, showing no idea of any changes. So when National Geographic said that dinosaurs changed into birds, as they announced in July 1998, of course just reflecting the evolutionary ideas, saying there's a dinosaur in your backyard, is pretty crude science. In fact, it's not science at all, because the one on the left has bones which are solid. The one on the right, a crow or whatever bird that they were trying to simulate there, it has hollow bones. And the way that the bones are put together is totally different. And so what makes my scientific blood boil, let alone my belief in the scriptures driving me to different conclusions, is when Scientific American, or National Geographic in this case, just sort of pull the wool over the public's eyes and do not give you the detail as to what's going on. And it is the detail which knocks complete holes in all their arguments. It is totally wrong to do this to the public, and even to those who perhaps know a little bit better but still get fooled. And the muscle arrangement of birds is so different to reptiles. There is a sort of a pulley mechanism where the bottom of the sternum of the bone structure in a bird is used as a lever, really, to bring the muscle here over for actually pulling the wing down. Time won't permit me to go into great detail on that, but the muscle arrangement with birds is totally different, because they need this very strong muscle in order to pull the wings down and contract the muscle, then pull it out again. And that is a very striking feature in birds. And to have the idea that reptiles could have evolved a mechanism where the muscles would change such that they could then fly, that in itself, there is no evidence for it in any of the fossils, even if I were to believe that the fossils represent a movement of time over millions of years, which of course I don't. And this pigeon here getting aloft would need tremendous muscle power to do it. But it does it with ease, because it's using this rope and pulley mechanism of the sternum bone and the muscle arrangement attached to the wing. Now, birds breathe totally differently. They breathe not like us with two lungs. They have one major lung, which is attached to lots of air sacs. And what they have the ability to do is not only just to breathe in and out laboriously like you and I do. You're doing it automatically. You better perhaps test that you are, because you're dead if you're not. But anyway, that's not good. I hope you're still alive. I know it's nighttime, but are you awake? I hope you are. Yes? Good. Yeah, you're still with me. Good. Now, the birds, of course, though, have a totally different mechanism. They have a counterflow mass exchanger. For those who are a bit more on the technical side, you might understand that there is a mechanism whereby the oxygen can come through the bottom of the lung at the same time as carbon dioxide is being actually pushed out. That is right at the bottom of the lung, right, as is shown in the diagram on the right here. So this mechanism means that sometimes the air sacs in birds are inflated and other ones are deflated. As the bird is breathing, the oxygen is being stored even as it's breathing out. It's still got an oxygen supply which is going into the bloodstream. Now that's very important, because birds have a very high metabolic rate. They've got to keep going because energy is being used up at such a huge rate. Let me come on to feathers, which are very striking. Primary feathers, secondary feathers, and tertiary feathers. Now, if evolution were true, then you've got to say that even to just get one feather would be remarkable. I'll go into the detail in a few seconds. But let me just remind you that you've got different types of feathers. And to get feathers in the right place would be quite extraordinary. If a dinosaur sort of suddenly tried to grow a feather out here, how does it know that it's got to have a primary feather in the right place on the arm, which is going to become a wing? I mean, it's totally ridiculous if you really think into it. But the detail is really where everything completely falls over. Apart from the structure of a feather, which I'm about to go into, just to get a primary feather, which is an asymmetric feather, in the right place, and then a secondary feather, and then a tertiary feather together, would be just not on. So the primary, secondary, and tertiary feathers have all got to be in the right place. And the primary feathers are very asymmetric. This is the primary feather of a buzzard. That's why I wanted it. The primary feather of a buzzard is very, very asymmetric, as all primary feathers are. The secondary feather is less asymmetric, and then the tertiary feather is virtually straight up and down, and you wouldn't see any really marked difference between the two. Now, these feathers are constructed in a most remarkable way. David Menton actually has some tremendous pictures, which I'm going to be showing you shortly. But there are many people who've written on this, but the actual feather itself now is a marvel of construction. As you can see here, the top picture is a pigeon secondary feather. You can tell that it's secondary because it's very little asymmetry in it. It's not quite totally symmetrical. And now we look at the detail. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the detail of the top section here. This is the main rachis, which is hollow, just like the bones, and what we call a quill, if you're going to use it as a pen in the olden days. And then I'm looking, as it were, at a square here, and I'm enlarging it here, just this bit here. And so these barbs you can see with the naked eye. These are the barbs. Then coming out of the barbs, going vertically in this diagram, are what we call the barbules. Now, the barbules you can't see unless you're looking under the microscope. The barbules will actually, if you look under the microscope, you'll see that they have hooks on. Now, looking at those sideways on, you can see the hooks on. It's rather like Velcro, okay? It has hooks. Now, it's not quite like Velcro, as you shall see, because the barbules going the other way, the barbules going horizontally in my picture, are not hooks. They are ridges. They are, again, looked edge on here. They've got little hooks on, but they're acting like ridges because the hook, if you like, is going the whole length of the barbule. So the word hook, perhaps, is better applied just to the first ones that I mentioned, and we use the term ridges for these ones. So you've got hooks on, in my diagram, the vertical ones, and you've got ridges on the horizontal ones. So the hooks grip the ridges, and so you have a sliding joint. That's where it's different to Velcro. So that means that whichever way I push this feather, right, okay, it hangs together. Now, of course, if I really push my finger through hard, then I will separate it out. But every time I do that, there is a sliding joint at work. This is a marvel of lightweight engineering, which means that evolution can be knocked over with a feather. Now, look, if you've got a sliding joint, what's the problem? If you've got a sliding joint, what do you need? If you're an engineer, you don't need to be an engineer to think this one through. What do you need if you've got a sliding joint? Lubrication. Absolutely right. Or oil, as I put there, lubrication. Fine. Well, where does it get it from? Well, it gets the birds, all birds get it from a preening gland, which is at the base of its spine. Right, I want you all to do some exercise tonight, all right? Just to make sure that you're awake and with me, right? All lift up your heads, and now please turn them 180 degrees, and you can't do it, can you? Not even the most agile youth amongst you can do that. Ooh, you can't just get your head around it, can you? Yet birds do it with ease. So you've got to have the ability to turn the head 180 degrees. You've got to have hollow bones. You've got to have special breathing. All these things got to be right for birds in order to work. And this is a white pelican doing it. Now, this is David Menton's picture. I asked his special permission to use it tonight. The fact is, I've been using it quite a lot anyway, but there we go. But thank you, David. And won't say any more about that. But look, feathers are made of keratin. And it's a lovely picture that he's got here, because you've got the keratin. This is not a bird on the right. This is, I don't know, it's a reptile, crocodile probably. So this is keratin scales, nothing like a bird. Now this is keratin feathers. Now, it is true that we've got keratin on our fingernails. That's if you've got any left, if you've been biting them so hard. And you've got keratin on your toenails. I'm sure you've not been biting them unless you're so agile to bite them as well. But there we go. But you've got keratin. Now, it's true, it's keratin. Yeah, I acknowledge that. Actually, if you want to really be sort of exact, it's not quite the same keratin. But we'll assume it's the same for the sake of the argument. But what's the big deal? So you made keratin scales, and they say, oh, the keratin scales changed into keratin feathers. Well, so what? Well, all sorts of things are made out of the same material. You use aluminium, or aluminum, or whatever you call it over here. You have hoods and trunks and all sorts of things I don't understand instead of bonnets. And anyway, we won't go into that. And you use aluminium to make cars, and you use aluminium to make aeroplanes. So what's the big deal? Well, the big difference, of course, is if you have the same material, fine. You need the information in order to make it. That's actually the big point here. You need the information to make scales. The fact that you've got the same material is no proof of evolution whatsoever. So I want just to suggest to you, really, that as I've been saying here, the aerodynamic excellence of birds is all dependent on very important, minute mechanisms like that I've been describing with a feather. Let me just one or two further details. Look, there are details, a little bit more technical here, but I think we need to just draw this out. There are things in the wings which are extremely important, but are easily missed. Did you know that there's a small little finger feather called the alula feather, which pokes out, and very important for this, for low-speed flight, keeps birds of prey in particular, and large birds, afloat on the air, even under low speeds. And you can see them on small birds here. The mourning warbler shows it here, and also, in particular, the white-tailed kite here, showing its alula feather. Now, here's another picture of them. This is the alula feather on a male American kestrel, and then another one here that I took on a red-tailed hawk, all showing this important finger, which is on the leading edge of the wing. Now, why is this important? Well, some of you in aeronautics, and there may be one or two here who are, will remember the Handley Page slot, which was invented sort of shortly after the Second World War, and it led to the whole idea of modern forward flaps. This is the forward flap here, which is used for approach and landing of modern aircraft. And that is all to do with actually increasing the camber, but the important point here is this, that this gap, I don't know whether it was important on this particular aircraft, but there are aircraft where it definitely is important as to how big that gap is, because that gap actually holds what we call the boundary layer attached to the wing. Because the danger is that at low speed, the boundary layer will separate from the upper surface and you get a stall. And if you've got a stall, then the aircraft or the bird just drops. So the alula feather is very important for low speed flights. And I could say more on that. There are hummingbirds here, which are demonstrated, which of course again illustrate the enormous prowess of some of the little birds, which are able to keep aloft. And as you well know, not like the kestrel, they hover by an entirely different principle. Hovering flight requires an awful lot of energy, particularly as with the hummingbird, it uses, not like the kestrel, just the last little bit of the wing, it uses the whole wing to actually get its hover, and this is how it does it. It doesn't have an elbow, like most birds do. It has a straight out wing, which it just simply moves any way it wishes. and it will sometimes bend the wing right over. And the reason it needs that swivel joint to do it is because it's getting a power stroke both on the equivalent of an upper motion. So normally the upper motion, of course, is like that, and the bird, other than a hummingbird, will do an elbow action. Of course, the elbow is that way around, and I can't do it, so I'm having to use my elbows like that. But you get the idea that a pigeon that I showed earlier will actually bring its wings together and then push the air down with the main thrust of the downward motion of the wing. Whereas the hummingbird actually twists its wing so that it gets a power stroke on what would have been the upper stroke, but now it's going in a downwards direction or slightly sideways direction, depending on which way it wishes to move. So let me just sort of illustrate this. It's doing a power stroke that way, then it twists its wing, and then it does a power stroke that way. So it's doing a figure of 8 motion. So next time you see a hummingbird coming up to your feeder, I wish we had them in England, but we don't, so you'll have to warm us up a bit more. But if you take a video of a hummingbird and then slow it right down, you'll see the motion of the wings, as is illustrated in the top right there, which is absolutely stunning to see. And it involves this figure of 8 wing motion. This is some clips which have been taken, which are absolutely marvelous, showing particularly the top left one here, showing this twisted wing motion of the blue-throated hummingbird. Absolutely lovely to see. The hummingbird also it feeds, of course, on nectar, and it has a little tongue which comes out, which has a double groove in it, and the tongue comes out 5 to 6 or 5 to 10 times per second. The wings are beating at roughly 50 times per second, which gives you the hum, which, of course, is why they're called that. But the tongue is also coming out at roughly 5 to 10 times per second, and it is literally pouring the nectar down its throat. Now, look, any evolutionary idea here completely goes out the window. Just take 2 of these facts. Remember, the breathing's got to be right, and the bones have got to be right, the feathers have got to be right, we know all that. But let's just deal with the 2 things which particularly single out hummingbirds, which is that they have a long beak because they need to have a tongue which feeds on the nectar in the fuchsia or the other plants that they feed on. But it's also got to obviously have the ability to hover. Now let's just take one of the things correct to begin with. Let's say that it had the ability, it had the long beak, but it didn't have the ability to hover. And, well, it just goes straight through the plant and out the other side, doesn't it? I mean, that's the end of that experiment. Well, let's say that, which way around did I put it? Let's say this time that it did have the beak, but it did have the ability to hover. Well, that's no good either, because, I mean, it's sort of busy hovering away, but it can't get at the food because it hasn't got the long beak and it can't get at the nectar, so that's the end of that experiment. So either way, you lose. Now, that's just 2 things which have to be right. In fact, there are many things which have to be right. And this is the whole point of Behe's book, by the way, Darwin's Black Box, which deals with the whole notion of irreducible complexity, which this really is an illustration of. That you've got to have everything right, or else if none of these things are, if any one of these things is not in place, then the whole thing just completely falls over. Birds, people say, came from reptiles which gradually changed into birds, and people talk about the Archaeopteryx fossil, and the curved wings, which are shown here, really show that Archaeopteryx, which I fully accept is a genuine fossil, by the way, I don't think it's a fake, that this really was a fully fledged creature. Okay, so we don't have them today. That's no big deal because we have plenty of creatures which in our own sort of history time have gone, like the dodo. I mean, the fact that birds become extinct or flying creatures become extinct is not an evidence for evolution. This was just simply an extinct creature which had curved wings fully developed for fast flight. And the fully developed curved wings really do indicate that this creature wasn't a halfway house to something else. And anyway, they found genuine birds which are actually underneath the fossils of Archaeopteryx. So any idea that Archaeopteryx is a halfway house is really just completely demolished by the fact that they found genuine birds fossilized underneath some of the fossils of the Archaeopteryx. And the fact that it has claws, well, there are modern birds which have claws. The Hoatzin maybe doesn't keep the claws all its life, but it certainly has claws as a juvenile. So that is no argument. Let me just point out, as I've been speaking about curved wings are very important for fast flight. And curved wings are also used as winglets by birds of prey, such as the owl. Now, we found that recently aeronautical engineers in the last 15 years have begun to sort of suddenly realize that this is a way, something that they could use. Douglas and other aircraft manufacturers have begun to put winglets on the edges of the wings of planes in order to actually reduce the induced drag, which is a way, of course, of saving fuel if you can reduce the drag. And this illustrates the point. Here are trailing vortices from an aircraft coming into land when I was flying recently, and it was going through very damp conditions. You could actually see the trailing vortex actually illustrated here. You can just see now as the pictures are emerging, you can see the trailing vortex coming off. This isn't off the whole wing, this is just off the curved surface, which is very marked and increasing the lift. And you can see the drag, which is actually being produced by the trailing vortex coming off this increased surface. Very good picture there, which actually shows you the trailing vortices. And it's these which the owl and other birds are deliberately making use of to actually extract as much energy as they can out of the airflow by having these winglets, which actually reduces the power of that vortex. And also there is aerodynamic noise associated with it. So all that is very important to birds of prey. And then, of course, finally, that's a nice little sequence there. And this is important because there is lift, yes, increase when you have low speed, but you also have a drag penalty associated with it. And the energy loss is controlled by those birds. I owe a lot here to Monty White, who pointed this one out to me. National Geographic, July 1998, had a progression, so-called, of reptiles going to birds. Now, you don't look at the detail, do you, when you sort of see a big picture like that? But when you do look at the detail, you find underneath these the pictures, it showed 120 million years, 80 million years, 90 million years. Something going wrong here. If you see what's going on, 120, 80, 90, 120, 150, 115, and then today. Something wrong there, isn't there? Even their own logic is up the creek. Even if you don't accept, even if you were to accept the millions of years, everything's completely haywire with the logic. You need to look at the details of what people are saying. Don't just accept things without thinking. One other point about birds before I move on to other creatures, and that's this, that birds of enormous size have been found in the fossil record, indicating very different climate conditions in the past. In Argentina, there was this huge creature found, 5 foot tall with a 24-foot wingspan, 4 times the height of a man, just put down, as it were. Giant pterosaurs have also been found. Giantism is evidence, by the way, for some huge climatic change. Because how could these large creatures ever begin to fly? How could they just sort of run along the ground and just hope to lift off? The indications are that possibly that means that the pressure was slightly higher in conditions in the past. And what other event could you look for other than the flood to possibly be an origin for tremendous climatic changes? I won't go into details there. People disagree as to what may have been the cause of the higher pressure in the past, but there is tantalizing evidence strongly suggesting that the things were different in the climate beforehand. Let me just move on to other creatures other than birds, butterflies, and then I'll briefly talk about bats. Butterflies have an extraordinary beginning. They start off as worms. What evolutionary madness decided that? And moths, obviously I've got it the wrong way up here so that you can see it. Here's a moth emerging from its chrysalis. The whole creature, worm-like creature, actually decides to die. The caterpillar dies, effectively, chemically goes into a soup, and then comes out again as a completely different creature. And yet all the information for that change is actually in the first creature, in the DNA. There is something actually telling it exactly what to do. And the wings then dry out of butterflies, in this case, not moths, and after the emergence from the chrysalis. And then, of course, we know the tremendous life that then follows of the butterfly, feeding on totally different substances and doing things entirely different to the caterpillar. The scales on a butterfly are totally different to feathers and show remarkable facets of, again, of engineering. The colouring comes from reflections, very much like the peacock, which some of you have seen outside. The blue and the shimmering lights are nothing to do with the pigment. They're to do with the reflection. Surfaces at very, very slightly different levels diffracting the light. The colour on these creatures is quite remarkable. The scales are so delicate that if you were to touch them, they would disintegrate. And yet butterflies show no evidence of any change from those fossilized in the past. They're entirely the same as modern butterflies. There is no difference. If you ask an evolutionist where butterflies come from, he won't have an answer, because there is no answer. There is no evidence whatsoever of any transitional changes to actually make butterflies. They just appear in the fossil record. The delicate membranes of some creatures are not quite the same as the scales of a butterfly. Some creatures fly with simply the blood vessels causing the wing, and there aren't any scales. The whole wing is just formed by a matrix of blood vessels, as in this lacewing moth shown here. Quite remarkable. The way butterflies fly has only recently been understood, and it's to do with the clap and fling principle, which was only discovered in the 1970s by a German called Weiss Vogt, and then Lytle, Sir James Lytle, who died a few years ago, also picked up on this and greatly developed the principle. And he did a lot of tracings, looking at videos and cinema photography of the flying creatures, and understood that there was a completely different motion to fixed-wing machines that we had made up to that point. And there is a vortex formed from underneath. This picture shows a vortex of the wing, actually as of a butterfly, as it is actually pulling up its wings. And the vortices form round the leading edge. So this is a picture from underneath of a butterfly moving its wings upwards. And this is the same thing from above. And so the actual curvature of the wings as they move them up and as they bring them down again is also very important indeed. Only recently has it begun to be modelled by people using supercomputers to model the vortices, in this case of a dragonfly, modelled both in the laboratory and in the simulation on the computers here. Dragonflies are quite remarkable because they are using two wings on each side, four wings in all, of course. And it was reckoned that Sikorsky, watching dragonflies and damselflies, got his idea for the helicopter. The aerodynamics of insect flight hasn't really even now been understood. Some people do not agree with Professor Charlie Ellington from Cambridge, who reckons that the leading edge vortices are crucial to small creatures flying through the air. But the disagreement, the very fact that there is disagreement, shows that there are principles here which are still not being fully understood concerning insect flights. When you have four wings, as with the dragonfly, sometimes it's the motion that way of the wings, the lateral motion of the wings, which gives the effect rather like a helicopter, which I was mentioning earlier. But dragonflies are exactly the same in the fossil record. The only difference is that sometimes you get them 3 foot in wingspan. Would you like to have met a dragonfly on a hot summer's evening? That large? I tell you, 30 miles an hour would have seemed slow to creatures of that. They would have gone much faster than that. Indications again that perhaps conditions were very different in the past. Nobody yet understands, by the way, how bees fly. Nobody yet quite grasps how a bee actually causes its buzz. Did you know that? I'm not saying that this is the answer, but it has been suggested. This was an article in Flight International some years ago. It has been suggested that the spiracles through which it breathes are actually being turned on and off in sympathy with the wings, so that when it breathes out, it could be causing an extra airflow which gives extra lift to the wings, and that it could be this spiracle valve system which is actually giving the buzz of bumblebees. It's not fully understood yet, and nobody has quite sorted that out, but research is continuing. Well, there's bats which are remarkable because they don't have feathers, of course, they don't have scales, they don't use blood vessels, they use skin over a membrane, and they are quite remarkable in themselves. Time won't permit me to develop the story of bats, but suffice to say that they seem to enjoy being upside down. Would you like to be upside down for more than a minute? Yet the blood flow, obviously, in a bat has to be different in order to make it feel comfortable to be upside down. Must be Australian, a bit like Ken, I guess. There we go. But these are the supposed transitional changes for bat evolution. Did you know that this has been in textbooks up and down England and other places probably? And yet the only two things which are found are the beginning and the end. The shrew and the bat. And yet people say that there are all the transitions in between. Oh yes, we know that they must be true, but there's no evidence for them even in the fossil record. Even if you were to accept that the fossil record was a record over millions of years, they are hung by their own arguments. They are hung by the fossil evidence, which doesn't show evolution whatsoever. There is no evidence for change in bat fossils. They are exactly the same as modern bats. 50 million years ago, supposed to be, and yet these bats look exactly like modern bats in terms of their skeletons. Well, we talked about 3 types of creatures which fly. If evolution was true, as I said earlier, then flight would have had to evolve 3 times independently. And yet, that would be scientific madness to say that that could happen. Well, what really is at the bottom of this? Well, you've got matter, yes, you've got energy, but the important missing jewel in the science of evolution, and it's not real science, it's just philosophy, it's just so stories. And that which is missing, of course, is the whole idea of information. Where does information come from? Natural selection doesn't increase the information base, it actually reduces it. Because natural selection changes what you had to begin with in terms of all the variety and the possibilities, and it changes it to a subset which is less. You ask any farmer who is breeding cows or breeding whatever, if he wants to get back to the original source, he needs to get an original Jersey cow or whatever it is that he wants to breed. If you start breeding artificially, you lose information. And so any idea that time is on your side is really completely missing the point. You could have 10 billion universes of 10 billion years, it will not help you. The direction of change is wrong if you're going to appeal to an evolutionary idea based on mutations. Natural selection, yeah, creationists accept that, we know that. That reflects the artificial selection that sometimes people do, as I said, as farmers. But natural selection is no friend to evolution, it's actually an enemy to evolution. Do you realize that? Natural selection does not help the evolutionist. He thinks it's his friend. Because information doesn't produce things. As Fred Hoyle famously said, he's died now, but one of his famous quotes was that he was no creationist either, but he said, to say that evolution happened is like a tornado in a junkyard producing a 747 or an aircraft or anything. It doesn't happen. And as I've been saying, that the individual parts in a bird make no sense, or any flying creature, until they are all together. The fact that you have hollow bones is no use to a dinosaur, is it? Crack, it's lost the dinosaur. I mean, what T-Rex is going to think of having hollow bones? It's no advantage to it. Look, what's really at the bottom of all this is the information which is stored in the little computer in the cell. The chromosomes in the DNA are carrying a huge amount of information. And it's the information which is really the whole missing jewel, as I said, in the evolutionist armory. He hasn't got any armor. He's like the emperor with no clothes. And yet people are saying, oh yeah, there's the emperor there, but the emperor of evolution has no covering whatsoever. There are no arguments. And there are no arguments because there is no information base in their reasoning. It's all got to come by chance. Werner Gitt, one of the most brilliant men in this area, often speaks on this whole subject of information, written the book. In the beginning was information, said, there is no known law of nature, no known process, no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. Let me just, I'm not going to hold that up. Let me just give you the picture of DNA. Look, DNA is made of a sequence of nucleotides which are in an order. And that order is important because that singles out a particular letter of the DNA code. So you've got cytosine, you've got adenine, thymine, and guanine, and the order of these determines a letter in the code of the DNA string. And the three of them together, cytosine, adenine, and thymine, will give you one letter. And then if you have adenine, thymine, and say cytosine, then that gives you another letter, and so on. Now, let me just briefly run you through some of these points here, because this really is at the bottom of the whole matter of where flight could have possibly come from. It's got to have come from an information base which was put there by design. Look at the problems that you've got with DNA. Did you know that the left-handed amino acids, which are proteins, as I've said, left-handed, and yet the DNA, which actually produces the proteins which you need, are all right-handed, right? There is chirality in the molecules. The DNA makes the proteins, and yet the DNA, which is actually full of right-handed molecules, is making something which is left-handed. So you've got a chicken and egg situation here. How on earth, in the idea that life came about by accident, are you ever going to achieve it? If you've got the very thing which is involved in life itself being totally different to the proteins which it is producing. And of course, proteins are actually involved anyway in the DNA. There's a real problem here. Francis Crick said this, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many of the conditions which would have had to be satisfied to get it going. Now, that is an incredible admission from Francis Crick. He's no friend at all of creationism. He would speak vehemently against it, and yet he says that in his book there. Now, look, what really is at the bottom of this is the information which is formed from the in the DNA. The information, of course, in binary terms, is stored in what we call the bits, the binary digits. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is that this is really so important when it comes to considering natural systems, of which flight is just one of them. All living creatures have the storage of the computer code in the DNA in this double helix that I've been mentioning. The storage of what we are and what makes us what we are is actually in this DNA spiral. And each spiral has 10 letters of the cytosine, the guanine, and the thymine. Remember that those three together make a letter, and then the gathering of the letters makes a word, and so on. And each spiral has 10 letters, and it works out at about just under 10 to the 21 letters per cubic centimeter. The information content of each of the 4 nucleotides is 2 bits, so the information density is just under 2 times 10 to the 21 bits per cubic centimeter. Now that's an absolutely phenomenal information storage. On these computers, like the one that I'm using now, you can only get up to 4.2 times 10 to the 7th, which is nowhere near the information storage in DNA. This is what we are dealing with. So the mere mechanics of DNA shout to us that here is something absolutely extraordinary, much greater than the computers that we have today. Sir John Sisson said he likened our present knowledge of the DNA language and now the human genome, which has the content of 35,000 novels of information, as being similar to the discovery of Egyptian hieroglyphics without the Rosetta Stone to help us. That was said in an interview in Britain at one point. And that was a very interesting observation. The Rosetta Stone was the key to understanding the Egyptian hieroglyphics at the top. The Greek was the same information as the Egyptian hieroglyphics. The same message, but in a different language. And that illustrates an important point, that matter and energy is not the same as information. If I hold up a CD, the CD doesn't, the material of the CD doesn't define the information which is on it. And this is the vital point when we come to living creatures and flight in particular. The information for feathers that I was showing you earlier, the information for this beautiful feather here, is actually stored on the DNA. Now, in information theory, I'll just single out two facts from this, but you can read this in Werner Gitt's book. But I'll just single out two things. You need, in order to get something to work, if you're going to make a machine, or if you want to pass on information, you need all those 6 things or 5 things that he's mentioned there, but you need an express thought, you need semantics, and you need a code in order to do it. I'm using English. I could have spoken in French. Not sure I'd really particularly like to, but or could have spoken in Japanese. But the information is the same. Information doesn't come about by chance. Information is something which actually implies that there is a mind. You need a code to get information across. I could have used Morse code. It would have taken me a long time to do the talk. But, you know, it wouldn't, that Morse code needs an accepted standard for whatever I'm going to use for the letters. DNA also has a code. There is an accepted standard, as it were, for the grouping of the letters which actually conveys the information. The 22, which is on this lava lamp, you'd said, boy, your time, something really is going wrong with my mind. If it suddenly started writing out letters that you'd recognize, it would look ridiculous, wouldn't it? But it would show you the principle that if you start seeing information, you recognize it because you understand the language. Now, there are principles to do with codes that you can understand when a code is being used. This whole idea, by the way, is behind the search for extraterrestrial life. They're looking for patterns and say, there's a code here. If they used the same principle for DNA, they would be astounded because here is shouting information, not just information, but a mind which has put the information there. And mutations don't cause information. They actually cause loss of information. Mutations generally lose information. Evolution is at work with mutations like this, the flightless cormorants. No, it's loss of information, as I've been saying. Information is only increased when you actually have a mind behind it showing you this information base and actually using that information to convey a message. Let me just end on this point, and this is an important point, because not only do you need a code, but you need actually the message behind the code. This is a different point to the one that I've just been making about having a code. This one is saying that the message is actually independent of the language. The first point was saying it doesn't matter what language you use. You could have used French, you could have used English, you could have used Japanese, you could have used anything, but the code implies that there was a mind. This point is saying that the message is independent of the language. The first point is saying that the material doesn't make the code, doesn't make the order of the nucleotides in the DNA. This second point is saying that the actual message doesn't make, the actual writing, the actual code itself doesn't make the actual message which is being conveyed. This message says John loves Mary. Well, he could have just used some sort of other means to show that he loved her. He didn't need to write it in the sand, did he? The message could have been conveyed in so many ways. He didn't even need to use language at all. And he could have expressed that thought without having to use an actual code to write it in the sand. So what I'm seeking to show here is that, as I've put it in 2 illustrations here, your house is on fire could have been conveyed by all sorts of mechanisms, but the message is not defined by the code that's being used. Well, I end on this little point. Here's a poem written by C.S. Lewis. Lead us, evolution, lead us, up the future's endless stair. Chop us, change us, prod us, weed us. False stagnation is despair. Groping, guessing, yet progressing. Lead us, nobody knows where. That's what C.S. Lewis wrote of evolution. I think he's right. This is what an evolutionist wrote, trying to take off John 1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word proselytized the sea with its message, copying itself unceasingly and forever. That's as far as they can go. Because, to be frank, they don't even know where the message comes from. They don't acknowledge what I've been saying about a message not being defined by the code, not being defined by the material. They don't say where the mind is. Whereas we know, of course, that the Bible clearly says that the message, which is the basis of all living life, is actually come from God himself. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. The invisible things of him are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Thank you.